Okay, this is going to be the final lecture for Unit 3, and this is on that International Energy Agency report, World Energy Investment 2025. It's a pretty phenomenal document. A lot of good information here. I thought it'd be really good to do the sort of regional overview. It's hard to pick what we're going to read for classes, but I thought this would be a really good spot to kind of give you an overview of where we are in all of these different industries, sort of across the planet from a regional perspective. Okay, so just the intro, basically, right? And I would say, open it up, kind of follow along. I'm going to talk about a lot of these charts, that sort of stuff. So the regional overview, first, it says basically we have about $3.3 trillion in investment expected in 2025 in the energy industry. And this includes petroleum, um, uh, clean and renewable energies, grids, infrastructure, all of this stuff. It's pretty cool the way they break it down. China has basically taken the charge in energy investment with around 1/3 of the global total in 2025, followed by the US and then by the EU. And then I would also point out that China's clean energy investments are sort of outpacing not only their GDP, but also their population size. And they are sort of leading in a lot of the markets, especially when it comes to solar and energy, not energy, but electric vehicles. And they're also trying to corner sort of that battery market. So um, that might be the next thing they sort of lock down if we're not careful. All right. Um, okay. Still on sort of the global overview, Africa is obviously lagging behind. They have about 20% of global population, only around 2% of energy investment, and their investment is still basically half and half oil renewable, right? Um, a couple reasons for this, and this will be sort of a theme across some of these regions, are their bond ratings, right? When you're trying to drum up investment capital, usually what you do is you publish a bond, basically, right? And then somebody will buy that bond, and then you guarantee them a percent return over a particular period of time. So, like the US Treasury bonds are generally 10 years, and then you get like a 4% return. It's somewhere like 4.16-ish% right now on the bond market. The problem is like the African bond market, like they're paying extraordinary returns on bonds, right? They're also, because their bond ratings are just so low because they're so risky. And so this sort of it affects their ability to even get hold of capital, right? Not to mention the fact that they're already drowning in debt, and most of their government expenditure, not most, but a lot of their government expenditures are already going towards sort of debt repayment anyway, right? And so not only do they have a hard time getting access to capital, but the capital that they've already borrowed isn't really being paid back very well, right? And so this leads investors to be very wary. Um, Africa's paying, I don't know, 8% ish on average. It looks like on their bond market ratings. Latin America is at about 5%. Southeast Asia is about 2.2%. India is about 3%, and China is at about 1%. Right, very sort of safe investment. Right. Okay. Another point, the strength of the dollar, right? The dollar has been very strong in recent times. And so, as currencies around the world sort of depreciate relative to the dollar, this is also causing capital access problems, right? Because their currency is not worth as much as this very strong dollar, right? Okay. The section on rising barriers to trade and the associated uncertainty around tariffs. So there's a couple different discussions going on here. and a couple things that I'll bring out throughout the lecture. So there are discussions of first, the supply line changes or shifts since the Ukraine war, right? And I would say that this is, yes, the Ukrainian war has led to a shift in supply lines since around 2022. And I would also point out that this is Ukraine 2, right? This all started under the Obama administration in 2014, where Crimea was taken. But there have been severe shifts in supply lines, especially when it comes to energy since Ukraine. Now, these shifts were already happening, though. In many senses, these shifts were really brought about by the COVID era. And when we started to discover, or at least developed countries started to discover that there were bottlenecks in their supply lines, and there were also strategic uh, items, products, whatever it might be, um, that needed a second look, right? And so we've been shifting our supply lines, especially away from Russia and China, of course, and so has the EU. Okay, another one, tariff barriers are increasing under the Trump administration, right? Tariffs cause uncertainty. They are causing pushback from the Chinese government. And so, like, this is just increasing uncertainty in the market, and that uh, tends poorly for investment, right? Like, investors hate uncertainty. Um, and the EU, not only is the UF raising tariffs against China, but the EU has been for a while too, right? And under the argument basically that the Chinese government, right, the Chinese Communist Party, unfairly injected capital into particular industries, including e-cars and solar panel installation, stuff like that, right? And that is absolutely true. There's really no doubt about that. But it also means that the United States and Europe or the EU um, don't have access to those cheap goods, right? To reliable, very cheap compared to like European and American producers. And so this is going to make the transition even more expensive if you're going to sort of increase your protectionist stance, right? Okay. Number three, no, let's see. Uh, yeah, retaliation, right? Yes, China's economy is not booming like it used to be. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. However, while the EU and the US are raising trade barriers or protectionism or tariffs or whatever you want to call it against China and Russia and others, um, China is fighting back, right? And especially through their critical minerals industries or rare earths or whatever you might want to call it. So, like lithium, cobalt, nickel, all of these sorts of things. Um, China has, over the last 15 years, made enormous strides in ensuring that they have, by far, the world's greatest access to all of those critical earth minerals through things like the Belt and Road Initiative and agreements they've made bilaterally to some of these states that have big deposits of these products. Um, but China has also been very focused on being basically the only place on the planet where these rare earth minerals are refined, right? So while they may be pulled up out of the ground in places across the world, Venezuela, the Southeast Asian nations, Indonesia, parts of Africa, none of those places basically can refine those materials. And so, I don't know, more than 90% of all the refining of critical earth minerals is happening in China. These are going to be vital to the future of the green industry, right? We need them for batteries, we need them for microchips, we need them for transmission lines, we need them for all sorts of stuff, right? And so, as they throw up barriers, um, it starts to sort of devolve into this tit for tat process, right? And this is causing a lot more uncertainty in the markets, especially as to especially as to whether corporations are going to be able to get access to these materials to even build out their products, right? Okay. Number five. The sort of, I guess, the researchers note that about $9 billion in new U.S. energy projects have been announced since the new Trump administration, basically in January of 2025. We have also seen a $9 billion reduction in projects that were canceled due to uncertainty that had already been announced, right? And so we are basically breaking even. And a lot of that stuff, I guess the new announcements are sort of the old energy infrastructure, petroleum and fossil fuels. Okay, on to the United States section. Um, Okay, I'm going to talk about sort of this key statistics graph for each region. You can see that the U.S. Is by far the highest per capita. A lot of that has to do with like the hyper wealth in America, driving up that sort of average per capita income or whatever. Okay, but we obviously have a much higher per capita GDP than the world average, right? We also have an outsized GDP compared to our population. We only have 330-ish million people in America, and this is only around 4% of the world's population, and yet we have about, what does it say, 26%, about a quarter of the world's gross domestic product or the world's productivity, whatever you might want to call it, right? Our economy. We also have the advantage of extremely good sort of bond ratings, even though these have slipped in recent times um, because of our growing debt to GDP ratio. Right now at about 125% of our GDP, our annual GDP, and so this concerns some of the bond rating agencies like Moody's and Standard and Poor, right, who downgraded us. I think it was earlier this year, which is the first time maybe ever, like the first time I can remember in my lifetime. Um, yeah, our country risk obviously is zero. I mean, we have great institutions, we have a great judicial system, we have great privacy laws and contract laws and all these sorts of things. So like we don't have much of a country risk premium. Um, our We are investing more in fossil fuels in 2025, basically. Excuse me, in 2015 than we were in clean. We have shifted more toward clean, but we are still about average with the rest of the world, right? We're not exactly, leading the world in clean technology or clean technology implementation, I guess I would say. Okay. Some of the stuff that was noted in the discussions that I think we should talk about is first, it's important to know that the United States became a net exporter of fossil fuels or energy basically in 2019, right? We had been a pretty massive importer for most of American history, but we are now the world's biggest producer of oil and gas, and with about 20% of the global total, right? So this is a little less than like the Middle East, which is around 30%, excuse me, but that's many different nations. So the U.S. has become the biggest producer. We are now a net exporter instead of a importer. Much of this new growth and what has moved us toward net exportation has been the growth in liquid natural gas, right? Yes, we are increasingly producing petroleum products and things of that sort, but LNG has really, in many ways, been led by America and the American system, right? And we are right now building out even more sort of um, export centers in ports around America, especially the Gulf. America invested about $60 billion in clean energy in 2024. I'll be interested to see sort of where that goes under the new administration. Usually, Democrats obviously are a little bit more gung ho about like climate change and clean energy and things of that sort. So we'll sort of have to wait and see as to which direction that tends to take. We There is a bit of a discussion here about the lack of competitiveness in the solar realm, right? And we've talked about that before in this class, and a lot of that has to do with China just pumping state subsidies into a particular few industries that they thought would be important 15, 20 years down the road. And they've been generally right so far, right? And so this was electric vehicles, this was critical earth minerals, this was battery technologies, and it's EVs and solar panels. And from the energy perspective, and then from the other perspectives, they've sort of focused a lot on military hardware, especially anti-aircraft stuff, aircraft carrier stuff, drones, and then I guess one other I would probably mention is the data realm, right? So computing, quantum computing, AI, microchips, all of these sorts of things. Okay. Oh, yes, there's another discussion here about America, and there's a little bit of a discussion about it in the sort of Japan and South Korea section about AI energy needs driving up costs massively in the next few years, right? They're going to see a huge ramp up in energy demand. We've already seen it, right? And it's just probably going to get worse. And so a lot of these companies, there's a lot of experimentation with what's going on here. Some of them are increasing dramatically the demand against local populations, which is increasing their costs because supply is basically inelastic because it takes years to build out this equipment, right, and to generate new megawatt hours. And so they're soaking up and increasing the demand and really kicking up people's utility bills. And that's starting to piss people off. I don't know if you've been sort of keeping up with the news over the last few weeks or month, but this affordability stuff is really hot, the salient issue in politics right now in America. And some of that, at least on the energy side and the utility bill costs, is being driven by this AI stuff. Now, there are other experiments going on with this, right? With geothermal. Some are considering building like geothermal plants underneath or near their facilities. Some are talking about shooting these things up into space and building like data centers in space so that they can draw solar power from the sun. And there are also this idea of SMRs or small modular reactors, which is like tiny little nuclear power plants for each factory, right? Which is a little disconcerting. They say, we've improved in safety dramatically. So, yeah. But a couple of universities are running projects right now testing these things. There are two that I know of right now. One of these are these sort of modular nuclear generators. They have a couple different names. One is at the University of Chicago, um, where the nuclear weapon was basically built originally. A lot of the sort of nuclear stuff was going on. And then, strangely enough, Abilene Christian University apparently has one of these. The other one that the government is sort of involved in testing and these sorts of things. So I was sort of fascinated. I want to know why Abilene Christian got one, right? There's 1,000 universities in America. So, okay. Yeah, we just talked about sort of the demand by these energy companies, AI companies especially, driving up the cost of utilities. Um, we're not going to be able to meet this problem head on for a while, right? And there's a few reasons for this. It takes years to build out additional megawatt hour infrastructure, right? The transmission lines, the power plants, the engineering, the picking a plot of land, everything that goes into it, right? This is a years long process that probably is going to underpace the growth of energy demand by AI data centers, right? These microchips and these sorts of things. And so they're expecting that right now, 2025, about 4% of all energy demand in the United States is being soaked up by these AI data trading centers. They say by 2030, only 5 years from now, that will more than double from 4% of total energy usage in the United States to 10% of total energy usage in the United States. And so, again, that is going to push demand factors way up, which is going to increase costs, right? And so there are concerns that these costs are going to be put out on citizens instead of the AI companies paying for this increasing costs of electricity usage. Okay, enough of that. All right, we'll move on to Latin America. Latin America obviously has less than the sort of global average GDP. It's pretty close and rising. Latin America's doing pretty decently these days. There are a couple of obviously like problematic countries. Argentina can be economically troublesome sometimes. Venezuela obviously is concerning from like a governance perspective. Haiti as well. And then a lot of sort of the middle corridor countries like Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, uh, not really functioning institutions, a lot of problems with drugs and violence, a lot of problem with gangs, and they also have weird sort of geographic situations where there's a lot of the land that can't really be accessed because of shit like volcanoes, right? So, yeah, it's a difficult area, right? Um, let's see. Most of these states get sort of pretty good debt ratings and have a little bit better access to capital than places like Africa, obviously, or like what they call Eurasia, right? Like the stands and stuff like that. Um, and so, like, it's not the worst of the worst, but it could be better, right? Again, a couple states like Venezuela and Haiti are real problem cases. The Central Corridor is very problematic. But much of South America, at least, is doing okay. Mexico, obviously, is doing okay. They have like drug violence and stuff like that, and there is corruption in their state-owned oil industry, Pemex. But it could also be a lot worse, right? Um, they're sort of lagging behind in investing in renewables and green technology. And much of the energy or sort of investment in clean energy at this point is being led by a handful of states, including Chile, Colombia, and Costa Rica. But I would add one more to that list, which doesn't actually need to invest much anymore because they are already at this point like 98, 99% clean energy, and that's Uruguay, right? Maybe like the best success case in all of Latin America is Uruguay. They have had some rising violence due to drugs recently, and one of their sort of state prosecutors was gunned down. And so, there are concerns about where they're going headed forward. But for the last 30 years or so, like Uruguay has been the shining star of South America. I would also point out that we have seen some changes in Brazil. Brazil is a middling case, right? It shifts back and forth between sort of leftist and rightist administrations, which can affect things, especially like deforestation, petroleum, all these sorts of things. But Brazil has found new reserves, so it does have some sort of petroleum heft to throw around a little bit in recent times, especially up off the northeastern coast, the very top of Brazil, where a lot of sort of indigenous live. They just opened up a new drilling platform in the ocean, from what I read in The Economist recently. It does cause problems, right, with the indigenous in the area, and so that can be a sticky situation. But I would also say the transition from Jair Bolsonaro, who was their former president and a very right wing, he was obvious, he was often, God, the word, he was often called sort of the Trump of South America, right? He was recently locked up in prison for, man, he got a long sentence from what I read, for basically his own January 6th, right? Like an attempted coup. And so he's in prison now, but Lula took over, Lula Ignacio da Silva, who is a leftist, right, and came from sort of a union background and almost like bordering on like socialist communist sort of. And so Brazil is shifting back toward green, sustainable, monitoring deforestation, these sorts of things. Let's see. I think that's a bit about it for. Okay. Oh, yeah, the discussion section, right? So the grid reliability is middling at best in South America and needs a lot more further investment to meet sort of growing energy demand in the region, which is predicted to be about 3% increase every single year cumulatively, right? So they're going to need some way to meet that demand over time as Latin America becomes sort of wealthier and wealthier, right? Latin America tends to lag behind on clean investments for a few reasons, including high interest rates, right? Because they have problems with inflation in that area. They also have some of those problems with like devaluation relative to the dollar, so their currency is becoming weaker, right? And they also have high levels of sort of debt to GDP issues, and a lot of their interest payments are taking up big pieces of their budgets, right? And some of these states have even defaulted in the past, like Argentina. Obviously, Venezuela's a shit show. But there have been problems in the past with some of the debt repayments for the IMF and World Bank. And so this causes some of that uncertainty for the investors we were talking about. Latin America has also sort of increased their involvement in rare earths, right? Some of these places have high levels of rare earth. The problems, though, are first they like we talked about earlier. They don't really refine it. They can't afford to build the factories out to refine it. Most of it is shipped to to China for refinement, right? And it would take billions of dollars, and they already have to build out more like energy grid and these sorts of things. So it's difficult to convince people to build out these refining facilities. And then I would also add, like, there's sort of an America problem here, where as America alienates Latin America more and more, right, through I don't know, lots of different things like the drug boat bombings and some of the like rhetoric that comes out of the Trump administration and some of our immigration policies, as Latin America starts to feel more and more alienated by the United States, we're seeing more and more of these critical minerals flowing into China rather than the United States, and so like this giant confluence of stuff, including what I just listed, but also like tariffs and all these sorts of things. Right? They are building a frustration in Latin America with the United States, and so we have actually seen a big shift away from the United States as a market and towards other places, especially China. Okay. The European Union section, right? So European Union obviously has advantages, right? Because they have really, really high bond ratings. These are generally very developed, very safe investment states. And they have low debt costs, right? They can borrow much more cheaply than say South America or African countries, right? The EU by far sort of sets the pace for the transition to clean energy and green energy and all of this stuff. They spend for every dollar spent on sort of oil infrastructure, petroleum infrastructure, et cetera, they spend about $35 on green tech, right? So that's a 1 to 35 ratio. So they are definitely sort of leading the world in this sort of stuff. The discussion session section talks about some of the difficulties, right? It has been a little more difficult in recent years as the dollar becomes stronger and stronger, right? Their currencies become weaker. They have had to also raise their interest rates to fight inflation post COVID and especially post Ukraine too. And so that makes capital harder to access, more expensive, right? Um, and just like the United States, they have some problems with rising costs and with supply chain issues. It is very difficult and sometimes takes years in advance contracts to buy things like the energy transformers needed for the wiring systems and these sorts of things. So there are supply bottlenecks that are becoming problematic across the planet, and this is not only making it difficult to access some of these technologies, but it is increasing the cost of these technologies as demand increases through this green transition, but supply has been kind of stuck. Um, we talked about the national security and sort of moving their supply lines away. Most of their petroleum-based energy needs were met by Russia at the time, right? They could have gotten them from Iran, but Iran, which historically they have, but Iran has obviously become a troubling nation since sort of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and so they moved their energy and petroleum purchases from Iran to Russia, and now they're again paying a price for not really thinking out who we're buying these things from. Um, let's see. I guess the last thing I wanted to mention is some of this green transition is also difficult for European nations too, right? Because a lot of the demand for energy is coming from the far north, right? Which tend to be a lot more industrialized, high tech, these sorts of things. Whereas the the most efficient places to place a lot of these green technologies like solar and wind farms off the coasts are in the south, right? Because the sun is shining on Greece and Spain and Portugal and Italy, right? And so there is this difficulty in building out the system because of that. Okay, we'll move on to the Africa section. So Africa obviously has the lowest GDP per capita on the planet. I mean, it is pretty miserable, right? And it really hasn't improved in a very, very long time. They have very, very poor bond ratings, high risk, right? They're rated as very high risk, um, man, for a whole lot of reasons, right? Most of it having to do with sort of institutional degradation or just non-existence and corruption, right? They also have really high debt yield payments on the borrowing that they've already done, and so they don't have a lot of wiggle room, right? They not only don't have a lot of money, but the money they do have is being spent on debt they've already incurred. Um, they are also investing more in the petroleum side than they are in clean, right? And this is gradually changing, but a lot of countries, especially on sort of the western coast, rely on oil exports and things, right? Nigeria and others. Let's see. Oh yeah, as the last point, like South Africa is the best in this model, basically, right? There's some in like northern Africa, maybe Tunisia, Morocco doing okay. But generally, like, there's not any one state you could point to and be like, this is the way we should be doing things, right? Like, it's just pretty piss poor across the board. Um, let's see. Uh, they did also mention in the discussion section about sort of solar is becoming more ubiquitous in the African energy scene, because of the reductions in costs, right? Every sort of square foot of solar paneling is becoming more and more and more cheap over time. But China was a huge backer of Africa from like the 1990s till the 2010s, basically, when they were trying to initiate their sort of one belt, one road, or belt and road, or whatever you want to call it. There's been a couple different names. They call it OBOR usually. This initiative, but China's had to draw back on some of this sort of one belt, one road policy because of uh, we're starting to see some cracks in their economy, right? Not only because of COVID and sort of supply line changes after the West learned some lessons on COVID, but also and sort of all of their manufacturing having to shut down during COVID, right? But they also have this really big problem with their housing market right now, where they built out $1 trillion worth of housing, and there's just no demand, and there are tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of units just sitting empty all over the place. And the companies that incurred the debt to build out all of these housing projects, like I think one's called like Greenleaf, I think is the biggest one. Um, they're having problems, like they're defaulting on their debt, right? And China's like, don't worry, everything's okay. But it's not good, right? And they're probably not going to meet their economic growth target of 5% this year. And so there are cracks appearing in the Chinese economy. Now, the Chinese economy is pretty strong. I'm not saying it's just going to collapse under its own weight, but there are problems that are starting to appear. Okay, next section, the Middle East. The Middle East has basically the same GDP per capita as the global average, right? And this also varies wildly in this area, right? So you could point out a place like Yemen, which is like extraordinarily poor, destroyed by a decade long civil war. Syria, kind of in the same boat, right? Like just absolute poverty versus a place like, I don't know, Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, which have some really, really hyper rich, some of the richest people on the entire planet, right? And so there are pretty massive differences. And then you also have Israel in the mix there, which is sort of like a developed economy, I guess you would say, but like completely different from the rest. It's an interesting region, right? This region obviously invests more in fossil fuels. It's the sort of butter on their bread, right? Like that's how they made their money. That's how they built their economies. And while they are trying to sort of diversify, obviously, especially the Saudis, right, which we'll talk about a little bit, they are also investing very much heavily in fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, again, are the main contributor to most of these economies, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and most of the members of OPEC are in this region, right? There are a handful of others outside the region, but this is the core of OPEC. They have the lowest cost by far of extraction around the world, right? It's basically just like laying on the top of the ground. There's very, very little technology that they often need to extract. And so this is a big advantage for them. They produce about 30% of the global oil, this region does, and about 17% of the liquid natural gas in 2025. There have been some really interesting movements. There's a big breakdown in that region where some states will basically just not allow foreign direct investment into their states, while others do, right? And Saudi Arabia is famously protective of their economy and doesn't want anybody to be able to sort of invest in their economy, right? They keep it close to the chest. But they have increasingly been sort of doling out foreign direct investment in other countries, including the United States. And they made a very interesting decision to purchase a very uh, big portion of the Port Arthur LNG facility here in Texas, in Port Arthur, Texas. Um, and we have also, I guess I should talk to you a little bit about the history here. Like this is a weird state. Saudi Arabia is. They are a big purchaser of United States military equipment. But Mohammed bin Salman, who is their leader, a pretty young guy, he's kind of like I don't know, he's kind of like a leader slash celebrity at this point. But he's a pretty nasty dude. He trapped an American journalist named Jamal Khashoggi in the Iranian embassy, and then they murdered him, chopped him to pieces, and melted him in acid. And so America and the West broke up with Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia for a couple of years, basically, and said, like, this guy's horrible. We don't want to deal with him ever again. And then, like, some energy crises popped up, right? Especially Ukraine war and these sorts of things. And suddenly everybody's fine with Mohammed bin Salman, including the Biden administration and a lot of European countries. So there's a lot of sort of wishy washiness here. Um, Recently, Mohammed bin Salman is actually here in the United States this week with an entourage of like 1,000 people, which is absurd. But he's really, really cushy with Trump. And so, like, there's a lot of concern that Trump and bin Salman are sort of handing money back and forth and these sorts of things. We know that bin Salman gave his son-in-law, I guess, Jared Kushner, $2 billion in seed money for his sort of hedge fund a couple years ago. So there are some concerning issues with this relationship, right? And the fact that Saudi Arabia is buying into America's energy infrastructure is also a little bit concerning. So I don't know, just some extra stuff I wanted to add that on the political side that is a little bit disconcerting, I guess. Okay. Eurasia. So this is Russia and the Caspian region. So this includes Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, and Iran. They have huge investments in fossil fuel, right? This is mostly what drives the Russian economy is fossil fuels at this point. Russia is a huge exporter, right? But investments have been trending downward in this area since the Ukrainian war or Ukraine 2, especially since it's been dragging on and on. Um, there are also concerns with the sanctions that the West has put on Russia, so they can't really access the newer equipment, drilling technology, some of the geologists and specialists that are needed. And so their industry is sort of, I guess, getting a little bit more defunct over time, right? And this is sort of the same thing that happened in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. Um, Basically, you can't invest in this region if you're from the West because of the sanctions. There are also they don't have great bond ratings, right? There are concerns about their governance and institutions, about expropriation of assets, all of these sorts of things. And these dropping oil prices have also hurt Russia, right? Because that's the main piece of their economy, right? Like at this point, it's a war and oil economy. And there are reports actually that they're having to sell for less than market price to China so that they can dump some of their product and have income, basically, right? And so not only are the low oil prices hurting them, but supposedly, according to some sources, they're selling for less than the market price for a gallon of, or for a barrel of oil. Okay, let's see. China. China's the next section. Let me turn on the light real quick. Okay, sorry about that. That didn't help much, huh? All right, China's the next section. China has increased to a higher than global average GDP per capita, so they are an up and coming economy for sure. Their 1.4 billion ish people make up not only the largest population on Earth, but also about one in every six people on the planet. They have really great bond ratings and borrowing costs, right? Because they have historically been very, very astute about paying down their bills and these sorts of things so that they get their bond ratings down. So they can borrow at extraordinarily cheap levels. And in some ways, for some parts of the world, they are actually the currency provider, right? Like they're the ones offering loans, right? They basically built this what's called I think it's called the Asian Interdevelopment Bank to be a competitive bank against the World Bank and the IMF, right? So that those countries who aren't in the West can come to China for loans, and so it's an interesting phenomenon. They have had a huge focus over the last 15 years or so. Like China has an industrial plan, like a 5, 10, 20, 50-year plan that they're always sort of updating. And so they invested really well because they have this industrial strategic plan that for the most part the West doesn't have, and especially America doesn't have, right? And so they focused very much on solar and EV and chips and AI, and military assets, right? At this point, coal is a big part of their energy mix. They had talked about 10 to 15 years ago about really trying to reduce coal fired plants, but they backed off of that some. They interestingly beat their Paris Climate Accord goals by 6 years, right? Like they are really on the forefront of some of these changes. Um, But they are also having some economic problems that are causing some weakness and some pullback from investments in clean energy, especially. And this includes the weakening renminbi, which is their currency, right? It's like what they call their dollar, the renminbi. It has been weakening relative to the dollar. They have very low consumption, right? They are a savings society or a savings culture, much like Japan, South Korea. They are much less likely to be out there spending money than the West is, right? America, especially, is a consumer economy, is a consumer society. Um, Whereas in China and Japan, South Korea, and other places in that area, they're saving 30 to 60% of their income every month. And so this can cause problems with your domestic market. And it means that they have to focus on exports, right? They have the housing crisis sector, which I talked about a little bit before, the shifting supply lines from the West, which we've touched on. And then recently, there have been some concerns about sort of the quality of their infrastructure. They just built this enormous new bridge and it like collapsed. And it was a brand new bridge and the whole thing collapsed. Like somebody noticed there were cracks. They sort of cordoned the entire thing off, but it just collapsed the next day. And so, like that sort of stuff doesn't really say good things about their infrastructure, right? They also they've signed at least 5 or 6 new agreements for nuclear plants to open over the next 10 years or so. So they're throwing more nuclear into the mix. We also know they've been snatching up uranium and plutonium from across the planet, not only because they're sort of rare earths, but because they're trying to build out their nuclear, not only sort of civilian nuclear capabilities, but also their military nuclear capabilities. And then, I guess the last point I wanted to make here is that the Three Gorges Dam is the largest hydroelectric plant on the planet, right? And so, like, they have a pretty interesting mix of different energy sources. Okay, India is next. They have a very low GDP per capita rating, right? It is rising. India is coming up in the world, at least economically, but they got a long way to go, right? They generally get pretty poor debt ratings, which means capital costs them more. They have to pay a higher interest rate. They've had pretty high investment in clean energy in recent years. And a lot of this is being sort of driven by the tech industry. They're really close to sort of Vietnam, China, where all these solar panels are being produced, and so they get them pretty cheaply, especially as the costs drop over time. One of the big problems is that demand for energy is rising incredibly fast, maybe the fastest on the planet. And so this is going to be very, very difficult to handle because just like China, they also have about 1.3, 1.4 billion people. And again, 1 in 6 of all humans on Earth, right? And as they become wealthier, they're going to be expectations for a lot more energy consumption. Um, One of the biggest problems, at least on sort of the electrical side, that the research was talking about, was that the distributors have a real difficulty providing payments to the power generators, right? And some of this touches on one of the papers from last week about energy theft, right? And they didn't really mention that, but that is one of the big drivers of why these transmission companies don't have the funds to pay the generator of the energy, right? And so there are serious arrears in their society between these two points of service. And this causes real concerns for investors about whether to invest in basically either side. I would also point out that cool little bubble graph that they showed that showed sort of income versus energy access. Um, a lot of that is the middle band of India, right? Like much of the middle band is where a lot of the wealth in India exists. This where the tech industries are. It's where the manufacturing facilities are. A lot of the north is very sort of agricultural, right? Rural, that sort of thing. And so that middle band plays a big important part in India and causes regional tensions too. I would add. Okay, let's see what's next. Japan and Korea, they obviously have very high GDP per capita. They generally have much better bond ratings and very low borrowing costs. Unfortunately, though, Japan, because of their sort of lost generation, right, has extraordinary debt to GDP ratio at about 250% debt to GDP. And this causes investor concerns, and so can cause some reductions in investment in the Japanese system. They both have high ratios of renewables to petroleum. Both of them have sort of learned their lessons on energy imports, right? Between their wars, World War II for Japan and the Korean War for South Korea. Uh, so they're trying as hard as they can to become sort of energy independent. And a lot of their societies at this point sort of rely on nuclear or liquid natural gas, but they are very much building out solar and especially wind, right? Because they're on coastlines, both of them are. They're basically both, well, Japan's an island and then Korea's like a peninsula. So three of the four sides are covered by water. Da, 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 da. Oh, South Korea, I would add, is going to have some of the same demand problems that we are going to see over the next few years in America, and we're frankly already seeing, right? Because South Korea is a huge world provider of chips and AI data training centers and these sorts of things, and these are very highly energy intensive industries. The United States, under sort of the CHIPS Act under the Biden administration, has pumped billions and maybe up to like $1 trillion into like chip manufacturing plants. But dude, it's gonna be a decade before we ever see a chip get made, probably. So, these are really long term issues. South Korea has had some political issues with the United States recently after the sort of famous perp walk in Georgia. Uh, I guess ICE, the Customs Enforcement Department, went into a factory in Georgia where they arrested like 300 or 400 South Korean like experts, right, who were legally in the United States to provide their expertise for like short-term jobs to get this factory in Georgia off the ground. Well, the Trump administration arrested all of them and then made them sort of do the perp walk on the news. And South Korea is furious, and South Korean sort of citizens are furious at this point, right? And so it has caused some real tensions between the two countries, and we'll sort of have to see how that plays out over time. Japan is a little cozier, at least at the moment, because their new prime minister, Sanae Takaichi, is a very sort of far right politician. And she came up under Abe Shinzo, who was assassinated a few years ago, um, who was very friendly with Trump. Trump really liked Abe Shinzo. And so Sanae Takaichi being Shinzo's sort of almost mentee. Abe really sort of brought her up. It looks like, at least they recently met. It looks like Trump is a little bit more friendly toward Japan than South Korea, and relations are a little bit friendlier as well. And we even saw Japan's tariffs sort of calm down after that meeting. Okay. Southeast Asia, final section. All right, so Southeast Asia has lower than the average GDP per capita. This area includes a bunch of nations: Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar slash Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia. I'm not really sure where Australia went. I don't know. I don't know where they plugged that in. It could be here, maybe. I don't know. Okay, and then just keep in mind that some of these places, especially like Brunei and Singapore, are little more than city states, right? Like they are absolutely remarkably tiny places. And so they have different issues than trying to build out an entire green infrastructure for a whole nation, right? Um, they have had pretty good economic times, especially because of that shift away from China's manufacturing goods post COVID, like we talked about, right? So a lot of the nations that are seeing sort of the boon from that are Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., as we move our supply lines away from China and toward those countries. Now, this is a mixed bag because from what we're finding out, most of those goods are Chinese anyway, right? And so, like, China just basically moved their manufacturing facilities or are just sending the product itself to, say, Vietnam. And then the United States or whatever is buying those products and claiming that we've like differentiated our supply lines. But the reality on the ground looks a little different from what we're finding out from places like The Economist and others, right? Again, they have pretty good bond ratings and low cost of borrowing, especially compared to like Africa or South America. They tend to be sort of lagging on renewable investments. They've been pretty petroleum heavy for a while, but this is changing pretty quickly. Their energy demand is going to change very quickly as well as they become sort of quickly richer, right? Currently, they have a lot of coal in their energy mix, just like China does, right? But they're trying to move away from that a bit. Um, and that's about it, man. I think I'm gonna leave you there. This is a lot of information, but I thought that this was a really, really phenomenal overview of each region and the breakdowns and all this stuff. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a lot. All right, I'll see you for the next one, and I will have assignments up ASAP.